The senator from Texas.
Mr. President, are we in a quorum call?
No, sir.
Mr. President, government funding, as we all know, is set to expire tomorrow night at midnight. And the Senate has the responsibility not just to keep the lights on, but also to make critical investments in our country. I could only wish that we had come to this point through a more rational and more deliberative sort of way. But unfortunately, this seems to be more the norm than the exception, where four people get into a room and they write a piece of legislation and they bring it to the floor, and your only option is to vote yes or no on it. We don't have a practice of making sure that on each one of these bills, people get to actually offer amendments and shape that legislation. I guess that's a quaint and old-fashioned notion, but that's how I thought the legislative process was supposed to work. But maybe that's a topic for another day. But it's unfortunate that this is where we are. Last night, 10 o'clock, the House votes on almost a 3,000-page bill, and then we're expected to vote on it the next day, or the next 2 days. This is not a way to run a railroad. But we all know that democracy is under attack in the world, and that means we need to do everything we can to provide for our defense and to support our friends and allies around the world. Now, we know that there's been a tug of war between our Democratic colleagues and this side of the aisle when it comes to prioritizing national security spending. And that actually was one reason why we find ourselves here at this late date, voting on this multi-thousand-page bill, because our colleagues on the other side of the aisle wanted to prioritize domestic spending, not national security spending. Thank goodness that's been now negotiated, where there is virtual parity. Thanks to the leadership of Ranking Member Shelby and our colleagues on the Appropriations Committee, the bipartisan bill includes $42 billion more in defense spending. And I can't think of any time in our recent history where we need that additional resources more for our security and security of our friends and allies. So this $42 billion increase in defense spending will provide our military commanders with what they need to respond to the threats that we are facing today and to prepare for those threats we see on the horizon. It's ironic, I find myself speaking to the senator from Maine, who I serve with on the Intelligence Committee, because he knows a lot of this subject matter as well, certainly well, maybe better than I do. But we all know that Russia's unprovoked attack on Ukraine was what we thought was a relic of the past. You know, my dad was a B-17 pilot in the Army Air Corps in World War II. He was shot down on his 26th bombing mission over Nazi Germany and captured as a prisoner of war, where he served for the last 4 months of that war. We thought, Europe thought, the world thought, that perhaps we had gotten beyond that sort of existential threat to our way of life, and that the autocrats of the world, people like Vladimir Putin, President Xi, the Ayatollah in Iran, Kim Jong-un in North Korea, that these individuals would be deterred from provoking a war like Vladimir Putin has provoked in Ukraine. One thing Winston Churchill liked to say, if there's one thing for sure, it's that humankind is unteachable. We keep making the same mistakes over and over again. We keep thinking, well, we can cash the peace dividend because that's in the past. And only to find ourselves, as Secretary Bob Gates said, he said, of all the military conflicts we found ourselves involved in the last several generations, we haven't planned for a single one of them. But we had to be ready, and we had to be able to defend our way of life and our values and our allies. So Russia's unprovoked attack on Ukraine is a reminder of the threats that remain to our freedom and the freedom of other democracies around the world. And so there could not be a more appropriate time to plus up our national defense spending while at the same time providing additional resources, humanitarian and otherwise, to our friends in Ukraine who are fighting for their very existence. We know that Ukraine is not a member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, so we have no legal obligation to come to Ukraine's defense. But I do believe we have a moral obligation to provide that assistance, both military and humanitarian. Russia has waged an unmistakable war on that democracy, violated the sovereignty of the Ukrainian people. It's even targeted civilians and brought immeasurable destruction to Ukraine. The only question is, after Putin has miscalculated the will of the Ukrainian people to defend themselves and the commitment of America and our NATO allies and other freedom-loving countries around the world to support Ukraine, now that they're bogged down, Russia's bogged down in Ukraine, the question is, well, is Putin going to give up? Is he going to try to come up with a face-saving device, or is he going to double down? I'm afraid, Mr. President, Putin's going to double down, which we're going to see more attacks on innocent civilians. We're going to see more Ukrainian cities leveled to the ground, indiscriminate killing of men and women and children. This is all that Putin knows. And the question is, how does this end? That's a chilling question. But the answer is even more chilling. As I said, I believe we have a moral duty to support Ukraine, and this legislation provides $13 billion in humanitarian, economic, and military assistance. And we need to get this money out the door as soon as possible, while the United States and NATO needs to continue to supply the javelins, other anti-aircraft, anti-tank weapons to help the Ukrainians defend themselves against this existential threat. The good news is this is a bipartisan effort. A lot of things we do around here, we divide up along party lines, the shirts and the skins, I like to call them. But the fact is we all support Ukraine, and we're all looking for ways we can help them during their time of need. Another thing that this omnibus appropriation bill does is it reauthorizes the Violence Against Women Act. This critical program has been defunct and moribund since 2019. For some reason, this was not a priority of this chamber or of this Congress for the last 3 years. But thanks to the leadership of Senators Ernst and Murkowski, Senator Feinstein was an essential part of the negotiations. We were able to reach a bipartisan agreement to strengthen and modernize this law. I'm a proud co-sponsor of the legislation, and I thank our colleagues on the Appropriation Committee for prioritizing its inclusion in this legislation. This funding will make critical investments for our country, including critical investments in our own people. One of the good things about this omnibus appropriation bill is it does exclude poison pills that included things like taxpayer funding of abortions. Those are not included in this bill. And while it's far from perfect, there's no question that a bill drafted solely by Republicans would look a little different. But the world does not operate on the basis of ideals. The perfect cannot be the enemy of the good. And so despite its flaws, despite the crazy process by which we find ourselves here voting on this $1.5 trillion appropriation bill, notwithstanding all the reasons I could cite why maybe I should vote against it, I think there's enough good in this bill to support it. Mr. President, on another matter, 2 weeks ago, President Biden nominated Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, and I know I mispronounced her first name, Judge Jackson, let me just call her, to serve as an Associate Justice on the Supreme Court. During his State of the Union message, President Biden said choosing somebody on the Supreme Court is one of the most serious constitutional responsibilities a President of the United States has. Likewise, I believe our responsibilities under the Constitution, evaluating the nominee, going through the advice and consent process is one of the most serious responsibilities we as senators have. And I don't take that responsibility lightly. Members of this chamber are pretty familiar with Judge Jackson's qualifications as she was confirmed to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals just 9 months ago, sometimes called the second most powerful federal court in the land, right below the Supreme Court of the United States. There's no question that Judge Jackson is an incredibly smart person and is all of the sort of pedigree that you would expect. Graduated from the best universities, the best law schools, had a broad range of practice. She received both her undergraduate and law degrees from Harvard. She clerked for a Supreme Court justice, Justice Breyer, and she served on the federal bench for nearly 9 years. I could say, as somebody who served on the state court bench for 13 years, I appreciate the president picking somebody who's actually had real-world experience on the trial bench. Too often, I think our Supreme Court nominees are academics and people who have very little real-world experience. But you can't argue that Judge Jackson does not have that kind of real-world experience, serving as a public defender, serving on the trial court, and serving on the Court of Appeals for the last 9 months. We all know that a nomination for the Supreme Court requires a rigorous assessment of far more than just a resume, though. Our framers set forth the role of the Supreme Court in Article 3 of our Constitution. And Alexander Hamilton noted in Federalist 78, the judiciary, he said, quote, would have no influence of either the sword or the purse. It may truly be said to have neither force nor will, but merely judgment. Now, if I can interpret what Alexander Hamilton was really saying in modern language, it's that judges shouldn't be politicians. They're not policymakers. That's why we appoint them. They are appointed for lifetime tenure to be protected from the pressures of politics or personality. And that's why they have such a critical and important role in our government. But it's not the same role as we serve as elected representatives. We are enmeshed in politics. We are directly responsible to the people, not for the legal correctness of our arguments or our legislation or constitutional interpretation, although I think we do have some responsibility since we take an oath to uphold the Constitution and laws of the United States, but it's different. And I think most people recognize judges are different than politicians. And judges should not be politicians appointed to serve for lifetime tenure and be unaccountable to the public and yet make policy. That's why judges decide individual cases. We don't decide individual cases here. We make policy for broad swaths of the American people. But judges decide cases based on a controversy, a set of facts, and the application of the law to that facts, which is, again, the antithesis of politics. That's what judging is all about. So the Supreme Court is not just another branch of government that you can go to if you don't get your desired outcome in the political branches. If you don't win the election, if you don't elect your like-minded representative, you're not supposed to just go to the Supreme Court and say, okay, now you give me what I want, because I couldn't get it through the political branches. The Supreme Court's not supposed to be a fail-safe to be utilized to deliver results that can't be secured through the legislative process. Our democracy, equal justice under the law, that's what it says right above the door of the Supreme Court of the United States, equal justice under the law. That can only be accomplished when the same law applies to all of us. And cases are therefore decided based on their unique facts, not on politics, not on personal preferences, not even on strongly held personal beliefs. This is absolutely critical to our system of checks and balances and the health of our democracy. So I look forward to meeting Judge Jackson in person. I've seen her across the hearing room when she was before the Judiciary Committee just about a year ago. But I want to ask her a little more about her judicial philosophy and how she views her role in the Supreme Court. Now, some have suggested, since she's been confirmed to the Circuit Court, that this ought to be a rubber stamp. Well, I don't view it that way. Circuit Court nominees and District Court nominees have to apply Supreme Court precedent. But when you're a member of the Supreme Court, there's no higher court that dictates the decision or the precedent you need to apply. Now, ideally, you're applying the statutes and laws passed by Congress and the Constitution itself. But there's admittedly more flexibility for the nominee, which means her philosophy is even more important to know now. I tried to flesh out Judge Jackson's judicial philosophy during her confirmation hearing for the D.C. Circuit Court. A number of us submitted questions for the record asking her to clarify her judicial philosophy and the way she interprets the Constitution. We've heard a lot of testimony over the years about originalists and textualists and different ways people approach their duties as a judge. I don't think Judge Jackson was particularly forthcoming with her answers when we asked about her philosophy, and I ultimately voted against her confirmation for the Circuit Court. Now, that vote is not going to determine how I view her nomination to the Supreme Court, but I think the question applies with even greater strength because she will not be bound by Supreme Court precedent. I know she'll have plenty of time and plenty of opportunity to clarify her views during the confirmation process, and I hope to see an unvarnished look beginning with our conversation tomorrow on Thursday. I'm also eager to learn more about Judge Jackson's views of the Supreme Court as an institution, which has increasingly come under attack by partisans, again, who don't particularly like the decisions of the court, but that's not supposed to be the test. The test is whether they apply the Constitution and laws of the United States to the facts found by the finder of fact. There's actually been a number of calls here in the Senate and in our political system in general to change the makeup of the Supreme Court, to actually add additional justices to the court, something that used to be called court packing back in the days of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But Justice Breyer, to his credit, whose seat Judge Jackson has been nominated to fill, has been a steadfast defender of the Supreme Court as an institution. And I hope Justice Jackson, soon to be Justice Jackson, takes her cues from her mentor. Justice Breyer echoed the comments of the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg and warned about a potentially dangerous politicalization of the Supreme Court and the consequential loss of public confidence in its judgments. Well, I'd like to know whether Judge Jackson agrees with Justice Breyer and whether she shares Justice Ginsburg's assessment that 9 seems to be a good number when it comes to the Supreme Court. So in the coming days and weeks, the Senate will thoroughly review Judge Jackson's qualifications, just as this body has done for every other nominee to the federal bench. This is a familiar process to most of us. Judge Jackson is the 4th Supreme Court nominee we will have considered in the last 5 years. But I hope there's something we do differently this time than has been done in the recent past, particularly in the case of Justice Kavanaugh. Frankly, the confirmation process for Justice Kavanaugh was an embarrassment, and I believe a black mark on this Senate. Conversely, I think we have an opportunity to show the American people how to do it the right way and treat Judge Jackson with civility and dignity, even when we disagree. We know that outside groups launched a full-on character attack against Judge Kavanaugh. Even Justice Barrett, more recently, was attacked based on her religious beliefs. I can assure you that will not happen this time around. We will meticulously review Judge Jackson's record. We'll ask detailed questions to understand her judicial philosophy. We will read and review her opinions and carefully evaluate her ability to serve. Through it all, there's no question that she will be treated with dignity and respect. I think the confirmation process must be thorough and it must be civil. The American people, and frankly, the nominee, deserves nothing less. So I'm prepared to fulfill my advice and consent duties as a member of this body and as a member of the Judiciary Committee. As we know, there's no particular timeline for this process. In some cases, it's moved quickly, and others, it's taken significantly more time. Chairman Durbin has announced the Judiciary Committee will begin its confirmation hearing the week of March the 21st, which doesn't allow much more time for our colleagues to meet with Judge Jackson before evaluating her record. And I know she's prioritized meeting with members of the Judiciary Committee, but I hope she'll have an adequate time to meet with other members who are not on the Judiciary Committee as well. I know our colleagues are anxious to expedite this process, but we all know that Justice Breyer will stay on the court until the end of this term, which will be the first week or so of July. Justices do not have term limits. They are not held accountable in elections, but they will wield tremendous power under our Constitution. So we have a duty not necessarily to get it done fast, but to get it done right and thoroughly evaluate Judge Jackson's qualifications and ensure that, if confirmed, she will serve as a fair and impartial member of the Supreme Court. Mr. President, I yield the floor.